Clean and unclean.
We're live officially.
We're officially live.
We're live. Ah! Yeah, we need to adjust just a wee bit here. Maybe back this thing up. There. Boom. I'm glad you guys are joining us today. We're getting ready. We're a couple minutes early. We're just going to let some people join in on our Bible study. Give a shout out if you're here. Avery, Isaac, Andrew, if you're watching with Isaac, good to see you.
Avery says he has 3 different screens on Holy Buckets.
Wow,
This?
multitasking.
Wait, three different screens of the same Bible study?
I'm guessing Avery meant like a video game and a TV and something else and a Bible study.
Sometimes I feel like there'd be like one word was said and then it came through the other one, so something on the lag. That would make me laugh.
Wish the sun would come out.
Tomorrow. That's your bottom dollar. That
Howdy, Jacob. Good to see you. Thanks for joining us again.
Great.
like a river. Or a fountain.
Becky has
What
homework.
did Avery say?
Homework on one screen, KCCI conference with the Governor Reynolds, and Bible study.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Laptop, TV, and phone.
Staying current with news is probably smart, and probably doing your homework is a good thing too. So we'll accept that this time.
Parents always told us, you need less screen time. Well, we can't go anywhere now.
Yeah, now we're trying to just make sure the screen time is varied. Yeah, we were talking just a little bit among us earlier about how one of the main excuses that a lot of us have for not seeking God more during this time through His Word and through prayer and through worship, one of the main excuses is time. We're too busy. We don't have enough time. And now all we have is time. So kind of like, what's our excuse now? And what was really our ultimate excuse before? And that was kind of convicting even to think about ourselves and our own walk. But you guys are here joining us now, and we're going to be digging into Mark chapter 7. It's a little bit shorter chapter than yesterday, so we're going to get started reading it. So Evan, you want to kick us off, and we'll just go around this way reading Mark chapter 7.
Clean and unclean. The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were unclean, that is, unwashed. Pharisees and all the Jews did not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to their traditions of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles.
We should read this passage a lot this time during this whole thing. Washing clean cups and hands.
So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with unclean hands? And Jesus replied, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites, as it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are but rules taught by men.
You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to the traditions of men. And he said to them, you have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and anyone who curses his father or mother must be put to death. But you say that if a man says to his father or mother, whatever help you might otherwise have received from me is Corban, that is a gift devoted to God. Then you no longer let him do anything for his father or mother. Thus you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and you do many things like that.
Again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, Listen to me, everyone can understand this. Nothing outside a man can make him unclean by going into him. Rather, it is what comes out of a man that makes him unclean. After he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. Are you so dull? He asked. Don't you see that nothing that enters a man from the outside can make him unclean? For it doesn't go into his heart, but into his stomach, and then out of his body. In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. He went on, what comes out of a man is what makes him unclean. For from within, out of men's hearts, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and make a man unclean.
Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it, yet he could not keep his presence secret. In fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, born in Syrian Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. First, let the children eat all they want, he told her, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Lord, she replied, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Then he told her, for such a reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. She went home and found her child lying on the bed and the demon gone.
Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon, down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis. There some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged him to place his hand on the man. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's eyes. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, Ephatha, which means be opened. At this, the man's ears were opened and his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone. But the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak.
Here ends the reading. All right. So we got our first question, which is, what stood out to you? What made you go, what? Feel free to put your comments in the comments section over on the side. We love to hear what jumped out at you as you listen to that. All right, group.
Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. I think I said eyes.
You said eyes. I'm literally picturing Jesus into the eyes.
It's the first ever recorded wet willy.
Yeah.
I can just see a ref popping up like, DQ, eye gouge.
No, but he.
Go ahead.
Not the White Willie, because he put his hands into the ears first, and then he
Then he spat. Right, I know. It was a dry willy.
When I read that, I recognized that I said eyes, but I didn't see that it was written ears. So at first I was like, what? Jesus stuck his fingers into somebody's eyes?
Yeah.
Oh, man.
It's a funny healing story.
It is.
Yeah.
And I thought the mud with the spitting in the eyes was weird.
Yeah, especially after all that talk about washing and being clean. You spit on a person's tongue.
Makes me think of like a Three Stooges scene where you're just like, healed.
Good. All right. I really like the bit of like the cultural norms that Jesus broke, in the fact that in verse 26 it's explained that she's a Greek born in Syrian Phoenicia, like that was important to the story, and the fact that Jesus is a woman. Clearly, like this people group probably was like a no, don't talk to them. And for like Jesus's birth status from the cultural group that he came from. and stuff, and the fact that he's still that those like things didn't matter and they don't matter, and
Mm-hmm.
Jesus was the perfect example of that.
Yeah. Awesome. Any other comments that you had that you wanted to share with the group through the chat, like that you found really interesting or really stood out to you or helped you like understand something in a new way? Any other comments from the group you want to mention?
I have a question about verse 27
Yeah.
and 28.
Move on to the next question.
You want to save that for our question?
Oh yeah.
Our question.
Yeah.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
Well, obviously the whole bit about washing stood out to me just because it's, the thing is, these rules weren't necessarily bad rules. It seems like in today we actually follow those rules. We wash our hands. I don't know if it was ceremonial or religious today, but then they would have said is unclean and all that stuff. But the biggest piece it seems like Jesus is trying to say here is like you are so caught up in your rules that you are like condemning people. Like you're more focused on keeping people out of the kingdom, and Jesus is more interested in bringing them in. For the Pharisees, the question is, who's following the rules the best? And for Jesus, it was not about that at all. And so that's why, he talks about how they have actually set aside the command of God to love God and love neighbor to follow their own rules. And I just think that was pretty interesting to me. Yeah. All right. Our next question is, how does this connect with any other scripture that you know? How does this tie into other stories or other things you know to be true? How does this help you kind of put some pieces together about what God is up to in the world?
Kelly just commented, Jesus is such a rebel in like the best way, calling out people when he has to and asking questions to really make the person think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Very much so.
We guess just comparing scriptures. Jesus quotes Isaiah. These people honor me with their lips. Or Isaiah says, prophesies about the hypocrites. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. And they worship me in vain. Their teachings are but rules taught by men. And my thing says from Isaiah 29:33. Which is good to have these footnotes, because I feel like I should invest in study Bible, but even these like just small footnotes, it helps remind me where in the Old Testament Jesus is quoting or others are quoting. There's a lot of like we talked about yesterday, Matthew says it is written a lot in his spots, and it's good to know where it's written from.
Kelly was saying that the last question was for her answer was for the last question, and Avery agreeing with her about loving the image of Jesus being a rebel. I can just picture Jesus like a black leather coat and leather sandals, like his like black sunglasses riding down. Noble speed.
Yeah, he was a rebel with a cause to bring people to God. That was his cause. Well, I thought about this whole washing and Jesus talking about the human rules and human traditions. And one of my favorite books of the Bible is Colossians. I feel like I've read it so much and I feel like I'm always going back to it. There's a whole section, especially in like chapter 2, verse 13 through, well, most of chapter 2 to be honest, but starting in verse 16 it says, "Do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of the things that were to come, The reality, however, is found in Christ. Do not let anyone who delights in false humility and the worship of angels disqualifies you. Such a person also goes into great detail about what they have seen, and they're puffed up with idle notions by their unspiritual mind. And the whole point is just that, all of these human traditions and rules that just in Jesus' day kind of had gotten piled on top of all of the commands that God had given. They said, well, and sometimes with the best intentions of trying to interpret, well, what does that actually mean? What does it mean to honor your father and mother? What does it mean to love your neighbor? And what does it mean to offer your first fruits to God? Well, they had to clarify it with some rules or guidelines, but they just became so burdensome that only the rule makers, ended up feeling like they were following the rules, but they missed the whole point of what God was doing. And I just reminded me that there are some things that were quote unquote commanded in the Old Testament that even clearly, like what Jesus is teaching here, just don't apply anymore. Like when it says, in saying this, he declared all foods clean. Well, like that, there's a reason that we don't have to follow all of the dietary rules of the Old Testament anymore. Jesus verifies that here. But it doesn't mean the whole Old Testament is not valid. But there are certain traditions and rules that Jesus seems to let us know pretty clearly, like, it's not what goes into a person. Yeah, that's what comes out. Also, kind of on a funny note, I always read the Bible from a junior high boy perspective too. So if you really want to impress your junior high boy friends and get them to read the Bible, tell them that Jesus talks about poop. It's right here in chapter 7, verse 17 and 18 and 19. He said, "Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach, and then out of the body." I was like that. Anyway, I can't help myself. I'm sorry.
I love that Avery also was commenting on that, not the poop part, but the other part. Was that think about how many things that Jesus did differently, though. He healed on the Sabbath, ate with the unclean, and completely ripped apart Pharisees at their homes.
Mm-hmm. And talked about poop.
And very much so talked about poop.
He completely turned over what they thought worship was.
Right.
Yeah, I guess that's going to go into our next question.
Yeah.
I have other words.
All right, well, our next question is, how does this apply to our lives? Like, what does this mean for me in the way I live my life?
I'm going to continue on saying exactly what I was saying. I know that question was said. But let's say anything that Avery said, Jesus turned it all upside down and stuff. And I wonder often, and I check myself often, are the things that we're doing, not saying that our churches are bad or things like that, but are the things that we're doing the things that God wants us to do? Or are they just traditions?
Mm-hmm.
And traditions aren't necessarily bad, but yeah, just evaluating that.
But we can fall into a routine to where it's more just practice, less and less emotion to it. So
and worship is an emotion, but less the actual act of it being worship.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which honestly, we could be the same exact people as Jesus is talking to here.
Yeah.
So there's nothing that says that we can't.
Yep, it's easy to fall into that.
Yeah.
I like the. I was thinking about this when I saw the passage verse or the heading. That's the words of clean and unclean, and Jesus hanging out with those that are unclean, and it just because I'm really passionate about, and these guys know this too, about Jesus' love and how that impacts us and how we put that into our own lives, and that that was one of the biggest ways Jesus showed love was that he hung out with the unclean, he hung out with the people that were considered untouchable, that were considered people that no one else can be around. Get away from me, no, ew. But it's Jesus, the guy that was the most important human being on the planet, he humbled himself enough to hang out with people that were not considered to be important people. You know, like imagine like how much impact that has on them, right? And so when you think about it, even in like high school, when we were in high school, you know, it's always those kids always thought that they couldn't hang out with the kids that were not so popular because it wasn't socially acceptable, you know. And like there's so many instances in our lives that we want to only we want to try to be a part of the popular kids. We want to be a part of the popular group, you know. Growing up, I'm sure almost every boy wanted to be a sports star, you know, at some point in their life, and every girl probably wanted to be an actress or a singer, or you know. And I'm sure there's guys that do, but you know what I mean. Like they wanted to be a part of the popular.
Right.
They wanted to be part of the popular of like what they wanted, because celebrities and actresses and sports stars, they're the most famous in the world right now. But the thing is that we aren't better than that. We aren't less than that. We aren't better than that. We are in the same playing field. And Jesus notifies that, and he lets that be the number one factor in his teachings, is that we are not better than one another. We are all on the same level playing field as each other.
I think there's a verse, and I can't remember exactly where it is, but it says, God humbles the proud and like lifts up the humble, you know, basically kind of making sure everyone knows their value and worth equally. I think for me, as far as application, I tend to be a rule follower. That was, you know, if there's rules, I want to make sure that I'm following them, and I think everyone else should be following them too. And so it's easy for me. I probably relate as much to the Pharisees as anyone in this, that sometimes I get more caught up in like, they're not following the rules. They're not doing this the right way, or they're not, you know, doing this at the right time or something like that. And not so much with like worship, but even just in life. And I think it's easier for me to be more judgmental. That's just something I always have to watch out for, that I'm loving people and showing love to people more. That's more important than following all the rules 100%. You know, am I keeping people away, or am I also, you know, loving people and welcoming them? Any other thoughts about how you feel like this applies to your life or challenges you to think about your life differently? Any other thoughts from the group?
You know, I kind of like, if someone else can do it too. But this is like this question combined with the last one that we had of different ways to think about how it whatever goes into other scripture. And I think about the passage about the, like, essentially, I don't know what it says or where it is, but it's what you put in is what is going to come out of you, and stuff, and like how true that is. And so this bit of, I guess, 14-ish to 23 verses, it just, I mean, for me, it kind of like looked the same exact as that. And I'm like, it's not exactly what he's saying, but it's like, what are we intentionally putting in our own minds, like filling ourselves up with? Because that's who we become, and that's what our hearts turn into. And whatever our hearts are, that's what we are. So,
yeah, Jesus talks a lot about bearing fruit. You know, you can tell a tree by its fruit, and in some ways, that's what he's saying. Like, what comes out of you is like, what kind of fruit are you bearing, showing the world? All right, well, let's jump to our last question, which is, what questions do you have about this passage? And feel free to jump in and add your thoughts about what questions, as you read this, is there something that makes you go, what? What is that? Or what does that mean for us? Or why would they be doing this a certain way? What questions do you have about this passage?
okay, literally verses 27 and 28 and 29. I have been confused about that since the moment I picked up my Bible ever. And it is so not clear. I can't even.
So let me just put words to your question and the elephant in the room sort of. Why did Jesus call this woman a dog? Is that kind of your question? Like, what is this even?
I didn't even know he was calling her a dog.
Yeah.
He
So
said,
here's what I think is happening here.
well,
And, go ahead.
because the dog thing, I have heard that bit before, but I didn't know that was his story. Because that's like, essentially, she's a different culture, but,
Mm-hmm.
and then she was like, no, that doesn't matter.
So this woman, like you said earlier, is an outsider.
Uh-huh.
Like she wouldn't be in most religious leaders' minds included in God's work of salvation and God's blessings.
Mm-hmm.
And yet she comes to Jesus, much like the others that we've talked about, the other outsiders. So Jesus is giving a little analogy here, and he's saying God's children, and he's saying like, okay, we don't give the food to the dogs, under the table. Like I think he's almost just like testing her to see what her response will be. And I don't think these are really like his words that he thinks about her, but he's saying, listen, like, don't you think that all of the children should eat first, the food? It's not right to take the bread and toss it to the dogs. He'd almost throw that out there, like we might use quotation marks. And she's picking up on that, realizing that that's kind of how people treat her as an outsider. And she said, no, but even the dogs eat like the leftovers of what the children get. And I think if you were to rephrase this in my mind, it would be something to the effect of like, why should, don't you think it's right that God would give his blessings to his children, the people of Israel? And she said, yeah, but even the outsiders that are among the people are blessed by God through them. And Jesus goes, in a sense, you have incredible faith. It's kind of like the other ones with the centurion with authority. And he's like, you have incredible faith, and for you, it will be done. Yeah, it's a really weird. At face value, you're like, did Jesus just call this outsider woman a dog? Not exactly.
In the beginning of this question, Isaac asked, "What made a food bad back then?" Which I think we kind of maybe just answered that question. Kelly said, "Why does Jesus spit on things so often?" Which is a fair question.
Holy spit!
That's right. That's right.
And then Avery commenting towards Isaac is, Isaac, I'm guessing it has a lot to do with Jewish traditions. I know that pork is viewed as unclean because it comes from a pig, but I don't know.
And part of that too was because of like health. And part of God's law was part of keeping people healthy. So maybe those I don't know about all of it. Like part of it just like wasn't good to eat back then because of.
Well, I know for pigs, it was thought to unclean to eat them because of what they ate, what their digestive systems were, because they ate muck basically.
Yeah, and I guess the science obviously wasn't there.
So if you really want to find out what the Old Testament laws are, go to Leviticus 11. There's a whole chapter about clean and unclean food. And the first section is that you should not eat food with like a cloven hoof or a divided hoof, or the pig, though it has a divided hoof, does not chew the cud. It's like you should only eat animals that chew the cud. That's what my translation said.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird, but there's even other things. It talks about don't eat creatures from the seas or streams that don't have fins or scales. Don't eat certain kinds of birds. Don't eat certain kind of insects, or any insect maybe. So there's a lot of rules and regulations in the Old Testament about what you should or shouldn't eat. Yeah. And I'm not saying you should go eat a bunch of bugs now, but.
Meanwhile, Iowa is a top pork producing state. I wonder what we would be viewed as if we were around back then.
Well, if we were Jews, following the law to the letter, we wouldn't be hog producers. Yeah. But that's part of why, when Jesus said, in saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean.
Yeah, and that goes with is it Peter?
Yep.
That went to the Athenian.
Mm-hmm.
He was invited to his house, and he was so anxious about going there because he's gonna offer me to eat food that's against my religion to eat.
Yeah.
And divine intervention, God was like, have I not created these foods? Are
Yes.
they not blessed? Are they not made by my hand? Eat the food. Tell him about Jesus.
Yes.
Just go and do it.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think going back to verses 27 and 28, your thoughts as to how that would be rephrased helps, at least me, understand a bit more as to why.
Yeah.
What it's being said.
Until someone shared it like that with me, I was like, why is
Yeah.
I don't get that. Yeah.
I guess my question would be how to pronounce that word, Evan.
There's a lot of consonants in that word. Ephatha.
Would you emphasize
There's
the
only 3 syllables.
F?
Ephatha.
Yeah.
Because TH, so PH makes an F.
Yeah.
Open wide. Yeah. Any other questions that you guys had about this passage? I want to encourage you to not stop asking questions. The questions that pop up might be trivial, but they might actually be important. And there are a lot of resources out there that you can go to. I mean, frankly, you can just Google your question, and you just have to be a little careful when you're sifting through answers, because anyone can write anything on the internet, right? Doesn't mean everything is true on the internet. Did you know that? Did everybody know that?
No, I read on the internet that everything is true.
Blue Letter Bible, though.
Yep.
One of the first ones that pop up, and it's legit.
Yep. Blue Letter Bible has some really good commentaries that help answer some questions. Definitely. Awesome. Well, that's all we got for today. Thanks for joining us for a live Bible study on Mark chapter 7. It's Friday. That means we're taking the weekend off. And we want to encourage you to be a part of your local church's worship services. I realize that's probably very different than normal. It might be online. It might be streaming. It might be a recording. It might be a radio. Whatever it is, it might even be a Zoom call, a meeting. So whatever it is, I want you to take part in it and stay connected. Don't neglect meeting together as well over the course of the weekend. And then we'll be back on Monday with Mark chapter 8. And this study of Mark is intended to lead us pretty much right up to Easter weekend as we wrap up the Gospel of Mark and hear the story of Jesus' death and resurrection coming up right before Easter. So keep digging in. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again later.
I love that, Avery. Yes, that is very true.
So the brain is the smartest organ according to the brain.
Love it. All right. Peace.
Bye.